The moment a waitress corrected a billionaire in front of his most important investors, nobody expected the billionaire to be the one left searching for words. The lunch crowd at Hawthorne House moved with the polished rhythm of Manhattan success. Crystal glasses caught the afternoon sunlight. Expensive watches flashed beneath tailored sleeves. Conversations about acquisitions, market forecasts, and private equity drifted through the air like a language of their own. At the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, founder of Caldwell Capital, a man worth billions and fully aware that everyone in the room knew it. At 41, Ethan carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent 2 decades being right more often than anyone around him. Investors trusted him. Executives followed him. Reporters quoted him. When Ethan Caldwell spoke, people listened. That afternoon was no different. A group of international investors occupied the private dining room near the back of the restaurant. Leather portfolios rested beside half-finished plates. A presentation glowed on a large screen. The deal being discussed could reshape an entire sector of the energy market. Ethan stood near the display, one hand casually tucked into his pocket as he explained projections and growth estimates. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. Nobody challenged him. Nobody interrupted. Nobody noticed the waitress quietly refilling water glasses except when they needed something. Claire Bennett moved through the room with practiced efficiency. 27 years old, blonde hair neatly tied back, black apron perfectly pressed. To most people she was invisible. Just another server carrying coffee and sparkling water. Exactly the way she preferred it. She approached the far end of the table carrying a fresh pot of coffee while Ethan continued his presentation. Based on current trends, he said confidently, clicking to the next slide, the projected annual return reaches 18.4% within 36 months. Several investors exchanged impressed looks. One of them was already reaching for a pen. Claire glanced at the screen. Then she looked again. Her hand paused slightly on the coffee pot. Not enough for anyone to notice. Almost. She continued pouring coffee. Ethan kept speaking. These numbers have been independently verified by our analysts. More nods. More agreement. Claire felt her stomach tighten. She knew she should keep walking. Keep her head down. Finish the refill and leave. That was the safe choice. The easy choice. But the number on the screen refused to leave her mind. She looked once more. The formula. The growth assumption. The decimal placement. Something wasn't right. A small mistake. Easy to miss. Expensive if ignored. Ethan smiled as he prepared to move forward. Any questions before we discuss final commitments? Silence. The kind of silence powerful people enjoy. Then Claire heard her own voice. Calm. Polite. Uninvited. I'm sorry, sir. Every head turned. Ethan stopped mid-sentence. Claire swallowed carefully, but didn't look away. I think there's a mistake in that projection. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The room seemed to forget how. One investor slowly lowered his pen. Another blinked in confusion. Ethan stared at her as if trying to determine whether he had heard correctly. A waitress had just interrupted his presentation. In front of everyone. Claire stood perfectly still beside the coffee service cart. Not defensive. Not arrogant. Just certain. Sunlight reflected against the screen behind Ethan while the silence stretched across the room like a tightening wire. And for the first time that afternoon, every person in the room stopped looking at the billionaire and started looking at the waitress. The silence lingered for another heartbeat before Ethan Caldwell finally moved. He slowly turned toward the screen behind him, then back toward Claire. His expression remained controlled, but a faint crease appeared between his eyebrows. It was the first sign that something had disrupted the smooth certainty of his afternoon. Around the table, investors exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody knew whether to be offended on Ethan's behalf or curious about what would happen next. Claire wished she could disappear. Not because she regretted speaking, because she knew exactly what came after moments like this. People rarely appreciated being corrected, especially in public, especially by someone they had already decided was unimportant. Ethan folded his arms. His voice remained calm, almost too calm. A mistake, he asked. Claire nodded once. Yes, sir. One investor shifted in his chair. Another leaned forward with growing interest. Ethan studied her for several seconds. And what exactly do you think is wrong? The room became even quieter. Claire glanced at the projection. The growth rate assumption in year 2. Ethan followed her gaze. Go on. She hesitated. Not from uncertainty. From caution, the percentage increase was applied twice. A few people frowned at the screen. Ethan clicked backward through the presentation. Numbers appeared. Charts. Forecasts. Projections. He looked at the formula. Then back at Claire. Our analysts reviewed this model for weeks. I understand. And yet you believe they missed something? Claire carefully placed the coffee pot on the service cart. I think everyone missed something. A few investors exchanged surprised looks. There was no arrogance in her tone. No challenge. Just simple conviction. Ethan took a step closer to the screen. Show me. Claire froze. Every instinct told her to refuse. Employees were not supposed to walk into presentations. Waitresses were not supposed to challenge billionaires. But now every eye in the room was waiting. Ethan handed her the presentation remote. The gesture itself surprised everyone. Claire stared at it for a second before accepting it. Her hand remained steady. She approached the screen. The expensive room suddenly felt much larger than before. She clicked through several slides. Here, the projection changed. Rows of figures filled the screen. Claire pointed toward a small section near the bottom. This adjustment already accounts for the market expansion factor. Ethan watched carefully, and Claire moved her fingers slightly lower. The same factor appears again here. Several heads turned. One investor pulled out reading glasses. Another opened a tablet. Ethan said nothing. Claire continued. The second adjustment increases projected returns by nearly 4%. The room remained silent except for the soft hum of the projector. Finally, one investor looked up. She is right. Another investor checked the numbers himself. That does appear to be duplicated. A third slowly lowered his pen onto the table. Ethan stared at the screen. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Calculating. Processing. The confidence that had filled the room 15 minutes earlier was now replaced by something else. Curiosity. For the first time, the investors were no longer studying the presentation. They were studying Claire. She immediately stepped back. I am sorry for interrupting. Ethan did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the numbers. Then he looked toward his chief analyst sitting near the end of the table. The analyst checked the figures again. His face slowly lost color. She is correct. Nobody spoke. Outside the private dining room, silverware clinked and conversations drifted through the restaurant. But inside, everything felt frozen. Ethan finally exhaled. Slowly. A 4% inflation in projected returns. His voice was quieter now. The analyst nodded. Yes. Another investor leaned back in his chair. That could have changed several assumptions in the agreement. The statement hung heavily in the air. Claire felt her pulse quicken. She had not wanted attention. She had only wanted the numbers to be right. Ethan looked at her again. This time differently. Not as a waitress. Not as staff. As a question he could not yet answer. What is your name? He asked. Claire hesitated. Claire Bennett. Ethan repeated it once, almost to himself. Then he glanced back toward the screen before returning his gaze to her. For the first time all afternoon, the billionaire appeared genuinely uncertain. And uncertainty, on a man like Ethan Caldwell, was far rarer than wealth. Claire wished the floor would swallow her whole. The attention in the room felt heavier than the tray she carried during the busiest Saturday nights. Yet she stood calmly beside the screen while a dozen successful investors looked at her as if she had suddenly appeared from nowhere. Ethan Caldwell remained silent for several seconds. That alone was unusual. Men like him built empires with decisions made in seconds. Hesitation was not part of their reputation. Finally, he stepped away from the screen and pulled out a chair. Sit down, he said. Claire blinked. I am working. For the next few minutes, I think we can make an exception. Several investors smiled faintly. Others seemed even more curious. Claire shook her head politely. I would rather stand. Ethan studied her expression. Most people became nervous around wealth and authority. Claire did not seem nervous. She seemed uncomfortable with attention itself. There was a difference. One of the investors leaned forward. His silver hair caught the afternoon light. Miss Bennett, how did you spot the error so quickly? Claire hesitated. I look at numbers a lot. A few people chuckled softly. Ethan did not. That answer explains nothing. Claire looked toward the windows. Beyond the glass, New York traffic moved through the afternoon sunlight. For a brief moment, she considered inventing an excuse. But she had never been good at pretending. I studied financial modeling. The room became quiet again. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Where? Columbia. A few investors exchanged surprised glances. One of them actually sat up straighter. Ethan folded his arms. You studied at Columbia University. Yes. Finance, economics, and quantitative analysis. The chief analyst looked genuinely confused. Then why are you working here? Claire smiled politely. It was the kind of smile that revealed almost nothing. Life does not always follow the plan we make for it. Nobody laughed this time. Something in her voice carried the weight of experience. Ethan noticed it immediately. The room noticed it too. One investor closed his tablet and gave Claire his full attention. Did you graduate? Claire lowered her eyes briefly. No, the answer arrived softly but landed heavily. Questions appeared on several faces, but nobody asked them. Ethan glanced toward the screen again, then back to Claire. You recognized the error in less than 10 seconds. Probably closer to 5. A faint smile appeared on one investor's face. Ethan almost smiled himself before catching it. And you are serving coffee, among other things. The answer triggered another wave of quiet amusement around the table. Ethan noticed something unusual happening. The energy of the room had shifted. Earlier, every question had been directed toward him. Now the attention naturally drifted toward Claire. Not because she demanded it, because she seemed entirely uninterested in having it. That intrigued people more than confidence ever could. One of the international investors opened the financial packet in front of him. If you noticed that issue so quickly, do you see anything else? Claire immediately shook her head. I have not reviewed enough information to answer responsibly. Ethan looked surprised. You are declining the question? Guessing would be irresponsible. The investor slowly nodded. Fair answer. Ethan stared at her for another moment. The waitress standing before him was unlike anyone he had met in years. Most people rushed to prove themselves. Claire seemed determined not to. Most people tried to impress powerful individuals. Claire appeared almost unaware of status altogether. Then something caught Ethan's attention. A familiar instinct. The same instinct that had helped him build a billion-dollar firm. There was more to this story. Much more. Claire glanced toward the dining room. Another table was waiting for service. If there is nothing else, I should get back to work. Ethan looked at the investors. Then at Claire. For the first time all afternoon, he realized he was no longer thinking about the deal. He was thinking about the woman who had quietly corrected an entire room full of experts and seemed eager to return to refilling coffee cups as if none of it mattered. Claire turned toward the dining room, hoping the conversation was finally over. She had tables waiting, orders cooling in the kitchen, a manager who already disliked surprises. Normal problems, familiar problems, the kind she understood. But before she could take a single step away, one of the investors spoke. Actually, I have another question. Claire paused. Ethan noticed several heads around the table nodding in agreement. The investors were no longer focused on lunch. They were focused on her. Go ahead, Claire said politely. The investor opened the presentation packet and tapped a page near the center. If the return projection was inflated, what would your estimate be? Claire immediately shook her head. I do not know. The answer surprised everyone. You just found an error in seconds, another investor said. Surely you have an opinion. Claire glanced at the document from several feet away. An opinion is easy. Her voice remained calm. A responsible answer requires enough information. Ethan leaned against the edge of the conference table. How much information? Claire considered the question. More than one slide. A few investors smiled. Ethan found himself doing the same. It was a small smile. Brief. Gone almost immediately. But it was there. One of the senior investors slid the packet across the table. Then take a look. Claire hesitated. She should have walked away. Every minute she remained in that room pulled her deeper into something she had never intended to join. Yet refusing would only draw more attention. Carefully, she accepted the packet. The room watched. Pages turned quietly. The soft rustle of paper became the only sound in the room. Claire read faster than most people thought possible. Tables, forecasts, market assumptions, debt schedules, risk assessments. Ethan noticed something unusual. She was not reading like someone trying to impress people. She was reading like someone searching for truth. Her eyes moved with purpose, focus, discipline. 3 minutes passed. Then 4. Finally, Claire closed the packet. The projection is still optimistic. Ethan straightened slightly. How optimistic? Claire looked toward the screen. About 11%. Several investors exchanged looks. Ethan folded his arms. The current estimate is 18.4. Yes. You believe the actual number is closer to 11? Possibly lower. Silence settled over the room again. Not hostile silence. Interested silence. Ethan glanced toward his chief analyst. The analyst was already reviewing calculations. A minute later, he slowly looked up. She is not wrong. The room shifted. Chairs moved. Eyes widened. One investor let out a low whistle. Another closed his folder entirely. Ethan stared at Claire. The confidence he normally carried into negotiations had not disappeared. But something else had joined it. Curiosity. Genuine curiosity. One of the international investors leaned forward. Miss Bennett, where exactly did you learn this level of analysis? Claire lowered her eyes for a moment. School. Only school. She smiled faintly. And a lot of library books. Several people laughed softly. Yet nobody thought she was joking. Ethan noticed her hands. No expensive jewelry. No designer accessories. Just the hands of someone who worked long shifts carrying trays and coffee pots. Yet those same hands had just dismantled assumptions made by highly paid analysts. It made no sense. And Ethan hated things that did not make sense. Then another investor suddenly frowned. He looked at Claire more carefully. Wait. The room turned toward him. Have we met before? Claire looked surprised. I do not think so. The investor narrowed his eyes. No, not met. He studied her face again. I know I have seen your name somewhere. Claire's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not fear. Not panic. Something quieter. Something older. Ethan noticed it immediately. So did the investor. The older man snapped his fingers. That is it. He sat forward in his chair. The National Collegiate Economic Challenge. 5 years ago. Claire remained silent. The investor pointed toward her. You were the finalist who published that market recovery paper. Several heads turned instantly. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What paper? The investor looked genuinely shocked. You have never read it. Claire quietly looked toward the dining room again, as if wishing she could be anywhere else. But the room had already changed. Because for the first time that afternoon, the investors were no longer wondering why a waitress understood finance. They were beginning to wonder why someone with her talent was still carrying coffee. For a moment, nobody spoke. The investors' words seemed to hang in the air above the polished conference table. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Not because she was surprised. Because she had hoped that chapter of her life would remain forgotten. Ethan noticed the reaction immediately. The silence told him more than any answer could have. The older investor leaned forward. I knew it. His voice carried genuine excitement now. You were 22. You published a paper on post-recession market recovery models. Several investors exchanged confused looks. One of them shrugged. I do not remember it. That is because most people ignored it, the older man replied. Which was a mistake. He pointed toward Claire. Her model predicted 3 major correction patterns almost 2 years before they happened. Ethan stared at Claire. Is that true? Claire looked down at the floor. Parts of it. Parts. Ethan asked. Most of it was theory. Theory that turned out to be correct, the investor replied. I remember because my firm used portions of her research. Another investor slowly sat back in his chair. Wait. You were telling me that the woman serving coffee wrote a paper that investment firms actually used. Yes. The room grew quiet once more. Not shocked this time. Curious. Respectful. Claire shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention. She had spent years avoiding conversations like this. Years making herself smaller. Simpler. Easier to overlook. Yet somehow the walls she had carefully built were beginning to crack. Ethan folded his arms. If your research was that valuable, why are you here? The question landed softly. No accusation. No judgment. Just confusion. Claire smiled faintly. Because life is expensive. A few people laughed. She did not. The laughter faded quickly. Ethan understood there was more behind the answer. Everyone did. One investor asked carefully, what happened after the paper? Claire looked toward the windows again. The afternoon sun had shifted lower across the Manhattan skyline. Golden reflections danced across the glass buildings outside. My mother became sick. Nobody interrupted. I left school. Her voice remained calm. Medical bills came first. Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. The explanation was simple. Too simple. The kind of truth that required no dramatic details. Everyone around the table understood exactly what she meant. One of the investors quietly removed his glasses. Another looked down at his notes. Suddenly the conversation felt different. Earlier, they had been discussing talent. Now they were discussing sacrifice. Claire continued. I plan to return eventually. A small smile appeared. Eventually just kept moving farther away. The room remained still. Ethan glanced toward the presentation screen. Millions of dollars. Market forecasts. Growth projections. All the things that usually dominated his attention. Yet none of them seemed particularly important at that moment. The older investor shook his head slowly. I remember reading that paper and wondering where the author would end up. Claire laughed softly. Apparently here. This time the entire table smiled. Even Ethan. But his smile disappeared quickly as another thought surfaced. Something was bothering him. Something he could not quite place. He looked at Claire again. Then toward the packet resting beside him. Then back to her. A memory flickered at the edge of his mind. A report. Years ago, during one of the most difficult periods of his company. An anonymous market analysis that had circulated through several firms. He remembered because it had influenced a decision worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Claire. She looked up. Yes. Did you ever publish anything under a research consortium called Northbridge Economic Review? Claire froze. The reaction lasted less than a second. But Ethan saw it. The investors saw it too. Slowly, Claire nodded. Ethan stared at her. Suddenly, the missing piece clicked into place. And the realization that followed left even him speechless. The room seemed to shrink around Ethan Caldwell. For years, he had remembered that report without ever knowing the person behind it. During one of the most uncertain periods in his company's history, the analysis had circulated quietly through financial circles. Most executives dismissed it. Ethan had not. He remembered reading it late at night in his office overlooking Manhattan. He remembered the precision of the reasoning, the calm confidence behind every conclusion. More importantly, he remembered that following part of its advice had saved his firm from making an extremely costly expansion into an overheated market. Ethan stared at Claire as the realization settled over him. That was you. Claire shifted her weight slightly. It was a group project. Ethan shook his head. No, his voice remained quiet. The lead author was Claire Bennett. Nobody spoke. Ethan remembered the name now. Not because it had appeared on magazine covers or conference stages. Because it had appeared at the bottom of one of the smartest pieces of economic analysis he had ever read. One investor looked between them. You used her report? Ethan nodded. More than used it. He glanced toward the windows for a moment before looking back at Claire. It prevented a decision that would have cost my company hundreds of millions of dollars. Several people exchanged stunned looks. The older investor laughed softly in disbelief. And now she is serving coffee in a restaurant. Claire looked down at the floor. I am also paying bills. The answer was simple. Honest. It carried no bitterness. Somehow that made it more powerful. Ethan found himself studying her differently now. Earlier he had been curious. Now he was trying to understand. Over the years he had met brilliant analysts from Ivy League schools, consultants with impressive resumes, advisors who charged thousands of dollars an hour. Many of them never demonstrated the clarity Claire had shown in a single afternoon. Yet here she was, wearing a black apron, taking lunch orders. One investor leaned forward. Why did you never return? Claire hesitated. The room waited. Because every time I saved enough money to go back, something else happened. Her voice remained steady. Medical treatments. Rent increases. Family responsibilities. She offered a small smile. Life has very creative timing. A few people smiled sadly. Nobody challenged her explanation. Most adults in the room understood exactly how quickly plans could disappear. Ethan noticed something else. Claire never spoke like a victim. She never blamed anyone. She never complained. She simply described reality and moved forward. That impressed him more than any academic achievement. Then the private dining room door opened. Claire's manager appeared. His expression was tense. He had clearly heard rumors about what was happening. Claire, he said carefully. Table 14 is asking for their check. The spell broke instantly. Claire nodded. Of course. She turned toward the door. Normal life returning all at once. Ethan watched her take a step away. Then another. It felt strangely wrong. As if an important conversation was ending before it had properly begun. One of the investors called after her. Miss Bennett. Claire stopped. Yes. The investor smiled warmly. Thank you for speaking up. Several others nodded in agreement. Claire looked genuinely surprised. You are welcome. Then she left. The door closed softly behind her. Silence returned once more. Not the shocked silence from earlier. Something different. Reflective. Respectful. Ethan remained standing near the conference table. His presentation was still displayed on the screen. The deal still mattered. The investors still needed answers. Yet his attention lingered on the closed door. Finally, the older investor broke the silence. "You know," he said quietly, "she might be the smartest person who has walked into this room today." Nobody laughed, because nobody disagreed. Ethan looked at the financial projections scattered across the table, then toward the door again. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning something far bigger than market forecasts. He was questioning how many extraordinary people the world overlooked every single day simply because they wore the wrong uniform. The meeting should have ended there. The investors had enough information to continue. The corrected projections were being reviewed. The conversation was slowly returning to business. Yet something had changed beneath the surface. Every person in the room knew it. Ethan Caldwell knew it most of all. He tried to focus on the deal. He truly did. He answered questions, clarified figures, discussed timelines. But his attention kept drifting toward the dining room beyond the closed door. Meanwhile, Claire moved through the restaurant carrying trays and refilling glasses, as though the previous hour had never happened. Table 14 received their check. A family near the window ordered dessert. A businessman requested another coffee. Life continued exactly as it had before, at least on the outside. Inside the private dining room, however, the atmosphere had shifted again. One of the international investors was studying the revised forecasts when his phone suddenly vibrated. He glanced at the screen, then frowned. "Gentlemen," his voice interrupted the discussion. "We may have a problem." Several heads turned. Ethan looked up. "What kind of problem?" The investor rotated the phone so others could see. A financial news alert filled the screen. New regulatory guidance had been released less than 20 minutes earlier. The announcement directly affected a key assumption in the deal. Silence returned. Not dramatic silence. The practical kind. The kind that appears when experienced people recognize that something important has just changed. Ethan immediately reached for the updated information. Numbers flashed across tablets. Calculators appeared. Analysts began reviewing scenarios. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The mood grew heavier. One investor leaned back with frustration. "This changes the entire risk profile." Another nodded. "The original structure no longer works." Ethan studied the data carefully. His jaw tightened slightly. The new regulations were not catastrophic, but they created uncertainty. And uncertainty made investors nervous, especially when hundreds of millions of dollars were involved. Across the room, conversations became more cautious, less confident. The momentum built throughout the afternoon was beginning to fade. Then one investor glanced through the glass wall separating the dining room from the restaurant. He spotted Claire delivering a tray to a nearby table. An unexpected thought crossed his mind. Has anyone asked her? Several people looked up. Ethan followed his gaze. Claire was speaking politely with an elderly customer near the window, completely unaware that a room full of executives was staring at her. The older investor smiled. "I am serious." Ethan almost laughed. Almost. Yet he understood the suggestion immediately. 20 minutes earlier, he would have dismissed the idea. Now he could not. Another investor shrugged. "At this point, I am curious what she thinks." Ethan remained silent for a moment. Then he stood. The room watched him walk toward the door. Through the glass, Claire thanked a customer and collected a receipt folder from the table. She looked peaceful, focused, far removed from billion-dollar negotiations. Ethan opened the door and stepped into the restaurant. The sounds of lunch service returned instantly. Plates clinked softly. Conversations drifted through the air. Claire noticed him approaching and looked surprised. "Is there another issue with the presentation?" she asked. Ethan stopped beside her table. "Not exactly." Claire waited. Ethan rarely struggled to find words. Yet for a brief moment he did. Finally, he gestured toward the private dining room. "A regulatory update just changed part of the deal structure." Claire nodded politely. "I am sorry to hear that. Would you be willing to take a look at it?" For a second, she simply stared at him. Then she laughed softly, convinced he was joking. Ethan did not laugh. Neither did the investors watching through the glass. Claire's smile faded. She realized he was serious. Around them, restaurant guests continued eating lunch, unaware that one of the most powerful financiers in Manhattan was standing beside a waitress asking for her opinion. Claire looked down at the order pad in her hand, then toward the waiting tables, then back at Ethan. The request felt impossible. Yet something in his expression stopped her from refusing immediately. For the first time that day, Ethan Caldwell was not speaking to her as a billionaire addressing an employee. He was speaking to her as one professional asking another for help. Claire looked toward the dining room clock. Her shift still had 3 hours remaining. Orders needed to be delivered. Tables needed attention. The practical part of her mind told her to politely decline and return to work. Yet another part of her recognized something unusual was happening. Not because a billionaire was asking for her opinion, because an entire room full of experienced professionals was willing to listen to it. Ethan waited patiently. There was no arrogance in his posture now, no assumption that she would automatically agree. The change was subtle but impossible to miss. Claire glanced toward her manager across the restaurant. He was watching nervously from behind the host's stand. Ethan followed her gaze. Without saying a word, he walked over and spoke quietly with the manager. Nobody could hear the conversation. A few seconds later, the manager looked shocked, then confused, then surprisingly cooperative. He nodded several times. Ethan returned. "Your tables are covered." Claire blinked. "You did not have to do that." "Maybe not." His voice remained calm. "But I wanted a fair answer." For a moment, she studied him. Earlier that afternoon, Ethan Caldwell had been the most confident person in the building. Now he seemed more interested in being correct than being impressive. That difference mattered. Claire finally nodded. 5 minutes. Together, they walked back into the private dining room. Conversations immediately stopped. Several investors sat up straighter. One analyst pushed a stack of reports across the table. Claire accepted them and began reading. Once again, the room became quiet. The silence felt different now. Nobody was waiting for her to fail. Nobody was looking for entertainment. They were waiting for insight. 5 minutes passed. Then 7. Ethan watched as Claire reviewed the new regulatory guidance. Occasionally, she made notes on a blank sheet of paper. Occasionally, she crossed something out. Her concentration never broke. Finally, she set the documents down. The deal can still work. Relief appeared across several faces. Then Claire continued. But not the way it is structured now. The relief disappeared. Ethan leaned forward. "Explain." Claire slid one of the reports toward him. "Everyone is focused on the compliance cost increase." Ethan nodded. "Because that is the immediate problem." "Yes." Claire pointed to another section. "Which means nobody is looking here." Several investors moved closer. Claire tapped a paragraph buried deep within the guidance update. The new incentives for domestic infrastructure partnerships. One analyst frowned. "Those are minor." Claire shook her head. "Not if the partnership structure changes." Silence. Pens appeared. Notes were taken. Claire continued speaking. Calmly, clearly, without a trace of performance. She outlined a revised framework that shifted part of the risk exposure while preserving much of the projected growth. As she spoke, analysts recalculated numbers. Investors exchanged increasingly surprised looks. Ethan watched the room change in real time. Skepticism became interest. Interest became excitement. One analyst suddenly sat upright. "That actually improves liquidity." Another looked up from his laptop. "And reduces long-term compliance pressure." A third slowly smiled. "How did we miss this?" Nobody answered. They were all looking at Claire. Ethan stared at the revised projections appearing on the screen. The deal was not merely surviving. It was becoming stronger. Several minutes later, the chief analyst leaned back and shook his head in disbelief. "This works." The words landed heavily. Not because they were dramatic. Because everyone in the room understood what they meant. Claire had done it again. Ethan remained silent. His eyes moved from the screen to Claire, then back again. The room gradually filled with quiet conversation as investors discussed next steps. Yet Ethan barely heard any of it. He was remembering the first moment she had spoken that afternoon. A waitress carrying coffee. A quiet correction. A room full of people who assumed they already knew who mattered. And now every person at that table was adjusting their plans because of her ideas. Claire gathered the documents and stood. "I should get back to work." Nobody tried to stop her. They simply watched. Because for the second time that day, the room fell completely silent. Only now the silence was not caused by surprise. It was caused by respect. Claire stepped back from the table and gently placed the documents where she had found them. The investors remained seated. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody looked away. The silence followed her all the way to the door. She offered a polite nod and returned to the dining room. Within minutes, she was carrying a tray again, delivering iced tea to a family visiting from Ohio, and bringing a slice of cheesecake to an elderly couple celebrating an anniversary. To anyone arriving at the restaurant that moment, she looked exactly like every other server on staff. Yet inside the private dining room, the conversation had completely changed. The revised structure Claire suggested was already being incorporated into the agreement. Analysts updated projections. Investors discussed timelines. What had begun as a potentially damaging complication had become an unexpected advantage. Nearly an hour later, the final signatures were placed on the documents. Hands were shaken. Smiles appeared. The deal moved forward. One by one, the investors prepared to leave. Before anyone stood, however, Ethan Caldwell remained seated for a moment longer. His gaze drifted through the glass wall toward the dining room. Claire was helping an elderly woman fold a sweater that had slipped from her chair. The woman smiled. Claire smiled back. Then she quietly returned to work. No audience. No applause. No attempt to draw attention to herself. Ethan slowly stood. "Gentlemen," he said, "before you leave, there is something I need to do." Several investors exchanged curious looks. Together they walked out of the private dining room. The afternoon crowd continued eating. Conversations filled the air. Claire was refilling a water glass when she noticed a shadow fall across the table. She looked up. Ethan stood there. Behind him stood every investor from the meeting. The restaurant gradually became quieter. Not because anyone announced anything. Because people sensed something unusual was happening. Claire straightened slightly. "Is everything all right?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then, in front of everyone, he said something nobody expected. "I owe you an apology." The restaurant became completely still. Claire blinked. Ethan continued. "When you first spoke today, I assumed you were mistaken." His voice remained calm and sincere. "The truth is that I was the one who was wrong." Several investors nodded quietly. Ethan glanced around the room before, returning his attention to Claire. "You saved us from a costly error. You improved a deal that dozens of professionals had already reviewed. And you did it with more humility than most executives I know." Claire looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention. "I only pointed out what I saw." "Exactly," Ethan replied softly. "And you had the courage to say it." For a moment nobody spoke. Then the older investor who recognized her paper began to clap. Another joined him. Then another. Within seconds the entire group applauded. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was something rarer. Respect. Claire felt her cheeks warm. She lowered her eyes and smiled faintly. When the applause ended, Ethan reached into his jacket and handed her a business card. "If you ever decide you want a different career path, call me." Claire accepted the card politely. "Thank you." Ethan smiled. "No, thank you." A few minutes later the investors left. The restaurant slowly returned to normal. Plates clinked. Doors opened and closed. New customers arrived. Claire tucked the card into her apron and continued her shift. As evening sunlight painted the windows gold, she carried another tray across the dining room. The uniform had not changed. The job had not changed. Yet something important had. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is not the one speaking the loudest. Sometimes it is the quiet person willing to tell the truth when everyone else stays silent. And that afternoon, a room full of successful people learned a lesson worth far more than the deal they signed. She did not raise her voice. She raised the standard.